Good evening, buonasera, benvenuti all'Accademia Britannica. Welcome everybody to our first Wednesday lecture in 2014. And we are very pleased to see such a numerous audience. Please keep coming back and support us in this coming year. I would like to mention that this is also our third event in our joint Humanities and Architecture program, which is entitled Meeting Architecture and the Creative Processes. It is a great pleasure to welcome our guests tonight, Vivien Lovell and Ludovico Pratesi. I have promised not to introduce Vivien, which will be dealt properly with by Ludovico. However, I cannot refrain from saying how pleased we are to have Vivien here with us tonight. As many of you will know, Vivien is not only a visual art curator and advisor, but also a member of the Art Faculty at the British School at Rome, Fine Arts Faculty at the British School at Rome. We have tremendously benefited from her expert advice and help. So we are very grateful for her contribution to the BSR and that she would come here tonight. But I will leave the proper introductions to Ludovico. In fact, I can probably get away with no introductions tonight, as Ludovico Pratesi does not really need introductions in Rome. An art critic, curator, and artistic director of Pescheria Visual Arts Center of Pesaro, and a contributor to the La Repubblica, he has been active on Rome's contemporary art scene for many years, curating numerous exhibitions, such as Giganti at the Fori Imperiali in 2001, Tutto Normale at the French Academy in 2002, Verso il Futuro at the Museo del Corso in 2002, to mention just a few recent ones. Ludovico's work focuses on three areas of research: the dialogue between contemporary and ancient art, the artistic trends of the latest generation, and the evolution of contemporary art collectionism. His activities and publications reflect these wide interests. He published two books, L'arte di collezionare arte contemporanea in 2010 and The New Italian Art, l'arte italiana delle ultime generazioni in 2012. He is also the artistic director of the Guastalla Foundation, an organization which proposes itself as a center for the spreading of contemporary art collecting. Between 2009 and 2011, Ludovico was a scientific curator of Palazzo Fabrioni of Pistoia and was president of the Italian section of the AICA from 2006 to 2010. He is currently vice president of AMACI, Association of Italian Contemporary Art Museums. So just to sum up, we are very privileged and thrilled to have such important figures of both British and Italian contemporary art scene here with us tonight. So it is with great pleasure that now I give the floor to Ludovico Pratesi.
Thank you very much for this maybe too wide introduction, but thank you. And I'm also very pleased, and I would like to thank you, first of all, the British School, to invite me to introduce Vivien Lovell, that is a main and important figures of, let's say, contemporary art policy in London and in Great Britain. Vivien Lovell is a curator, but more than this, she is interested in the relations between contemporary art, architecture, and public spaces. She founded in 1999. She founded an organization called Modus Operandi, that is a kind of a mediator between public art, contemporary, let's say projects, urbanism, companies, and with this organization, she tried to put together some collaborations between artists, architecture, urbanists, and of course people from the industry and the art world. With Modus Operandi, Vivien made more than 110 projects in London and in Great Britain, and also in the world. And these projects are very interesting and very good and precise occasion to meet and to build up some fantastic occasion for artists, architects, urbanists and intellectuals to work together on the public field, on the public and urban field. I think that the experience of modus operandi that Vivien will explain in a very precise way this night with us is very, very interesting regarding this country and this city. As you know, Rome was for centuries a place of meeting between artists, architects and intellectuals. And now it's rare to have these occasions, and there's no organization like Modus Operandi, not private or public, to build up a program of some specific and very, let's say, very energetic strategies for it. I think that the experience of Vivien will be perfectly fit for a reflection about public art in Italy and in Rome, compared to the experience that Vivien had and has also in Great Britain and in the world, working with this very interesting and complex field of research. I would like to introduce you Vivien Lovell. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation, Marina and Christopher. So my talk is on collaborations, interventions and confrontations. It is not an advertisement for modus operandi, but I will refer to some of our own projects within the context of many other international examples. So I'd like to start my presentation by talking about the relationship of art to architecture from the early 20th century, and starting with international modernism and the Bauhaus, of course, of which Mies van der Rohe was a key member, which was one of best-known attempts in the 20th century within the creative professional sphere to bring together the fields of architecture, art, craft and the performing arts in collaboration. And artists produced, of course, ballet and craft. So there was a lot of crossover between those disciplines. And simultaneously, of course, in the USA, the Black Mountain College, founded in 1933, which lasted until 1957, had similar ambitions, and it attracted outstanding teachers such as John Cage, Merce Cunningham, Buckminster Fuller, the Albers, and Gropius. Of course, there'd been an exodus by that time from the Bauhaus to the States. But nevertheless, when one considers Bauhaus examples, the role of the artwork within architecture as a single focal point rather than collaboration of a shared concept is evident. And here in the Barcelona Pavilion by Mies, the cat, by the way, is real, not a sculpture. It's waited a long time to get that photograph. But here is the sculpture by Georg Kolbe, where we see art as a foil to the architecture, an organic foil. It isn't something that is intrinsically part of the building. And roughly the same date, a few years later, in Britain, the Delaware Pavilion in Bexhill-on-Sea, a shining example of modernism in the UK, and one that was very influential on me as a child. It was my first experience of real architecture. This too had its artwork by Edward Wadsworth sadly lost and now being recreated by a further artist. So there was a will, both before Second World War and after, this is after, continued in the 50s, where we see with this spirit of enthusiasm and innovation exemplified by the Festival of Britain, there was a great showcasing and beginnings of crossings over boundaries between disciplines at that time. This is the Time Life building with its frieze by Henry Moore, 52-3, and then a few years later, of course, the This Is Tomorrow exhibition, which Marina Engel refers to in her introduction to this lecture series, and which encouraged interdisciplinary collaborations between artists, architects, musicians, designers, and so on. Also in the 50s, an early model of a town artist evolved in Britain. The artist Victor Passmore was invited to advise on the design and planning of the new town Peterlee, County Durham. This was after Lubetkin, Bertolt Lubetkin, had resigned, unable to deliver his vision. But Passmore's involvement lasted until the 70s, which culminated in his pavilion, the Apollo Pavilion, long in disrepair and now restored. An early example of that building typology, the pavilion. Now, meanwhile, internationally, as a result of Percent for Art policies, and some of you will be familiar with this policy, which is the case in many countries internationally, whereby roughly 1% usually of capital budgets for new building refurbishments is allocated to the commissioning of art and craft and creativity within the building. This started simultaneously in Sweden, Germany and England in the 30s, and then from the 50s and 60s it was carried forward, and notably in the United States, where a good flagship example from the 80s, much quoted, is the work of the architect I.M. Pei at MIT in 85, with its artworks by Scott Burton and Kenneth Nolan. Scott Burton, the late sculptor, Kenneth Nolan, the painter. Whereas you see, art is intrinsically part of the architecture. If you take away the art, you take away the architecture. And the notion of artists as members of design teams began to gain ground really from the 70s and 80s onwards. And so collaborations evolved, a new wave of collaborations, and these became increasingly fashionable. Collaboration, of course, remains an overused term, frequently meaning simply cooperation. After all, one definition of collaboration is to collaborate with the enemy. True collaboration on a shared concept through to realization is still pretty rare, but it does happen. According to Catherine Clark of MUF, collaboration is like a love affair, she says. It segues from admiration to anxiety, rejection to rage, desire to envy, powerlessness to misunderstanding, from not getting what you want, but maybe coming nearer to knowing what you thought that might be. Here we see a collaboration between the architect Stephen Hull and Vito Conci, the artist, in the early 90s. And they were commissioned as a collaborative team by Storefronts for Art and Architecture, which is a well-known gallery in Tribeca. And the gallery itself is a limited, narrow wedge in plan. And so the facade is incredibly important. It's the conflation between outside and inside, between public and private. And so Conci and Hull began to challenge the exclusivity, as they saw it, of the gallery, where only those on the inside belong, and they sought to bring the public in from the outside and inserted this series of hinged panels which are arranged in a puzzle-like configuration. And when they're in their open position, the facade dissolves. So this is an example of a true collaboration. It wasn't easy. I interviewed both artist and architect in New York a few years ago separately, and they said it was fine when they were together, they would agree what to do, then they would go each back to their studios and work separately and end up miles apart, and then come together again in a meeting and have to resolve where they'd erred, as it were. Interesting, but it has recently been refurbished and is an excellent example. Such collaborations rely on the generosity of both parties to share ideas whilst recognising different creative standpoints. Jacques Herzog, the architect, has said that artists shouldn't do architecture and architects shouldn't do art. Rather, there should be a discussion amongst equals and a mutual respect for differences. Which brings one to Herzog and de Meuron, that well-renowned duo of Swiss architects. Since their student days in the late 60s, they developed a strong reputation for collaborating with artists. They've had a deep interest in art and hung out with artists such as Beuys. They were inspired by the work of Beuys and by Donald Judd. In minimalism, they found things they were looking for as architects. So this was question of art influencing architecture. And it was considered quite radical at that time to collaborate with artists. They felt there was a real sense of urgency. Artists were engaged in social disciplines, part of the creative ferment of the time, the student uprisings, and the emerging role of the artists engaged in the community and political issues. It was a time in Britain when Artist Placement Group was founded, for example. And artists were looking for different ways of showing their work, different kinds of gallery, which Herzog and de Meuron have gone on to provide. But their approach to art as ornaments we see here in the Eberswalder Library, where they collaborated with Thomas Ruff, as it were, as they described it, tattooing the building. The images are drawn from a collection of Ruff's newspaper photographs. It's a small budget, very tight program. And they developed this new technique with Ruff for engraving photographic images onto the surface of concrete. So here, structure and space and form and ornaments all allied. And the ornament almost constitutes the architecture. Whereas, that's an example of their gallery work, where they designed the gallery of Remy Zaug, one of the artists they collaborated with over many years, and they were strongly influenced by Remy Zaug's book on gallery design. In London, Herzog and de Meuron worked on the Laban Centre for Dance from 1987 to 2003, with integrated works by Michael Craig Martin, with whom they were already collaborating on Tate Modern. Michael Craig Martin, artist, was a member of their design team at the time, as well as a trustee of Tate. And visible output being this temporary light cap on the chimney of Tate Modern. But in the Laban Centre, according to Craig Martin, he felt the architect's approach was essentially conceptual, and the design emerges from the project, and their way of thinking is familiar to many artists, and it allows them an expressive freedom and daring, more often associated with art than with architecture. Now, the architects here knew that they wanted to use colour as a defining feature of the Laban Centre, and Craig Martin devised a way of integrating the solid interior surfaces with this translucent skin of the exterior of the building. So interior and exterior are linked. Other recent collaborations by Herzog and de Meuron with artists include the Beijing Olympic Stadium, of course, with Ai Weiwei. It's interesting the way that this collaboration came about, because it is very rare for those architects to work with an artist they don't know and understand in advance. And in fact, because it was their first work in China, they asked the Swiss ambassador to China's advice, who put them in touch with Ai Weiwei, who encouraged the form of the bird's nest, emphasized the shape of Chinese culture and not be considered alien, and it quickly became, of course, a public place, a park, a public sculpture, a place to meet. And they then went on to collaborate with Ai Weiwei on the Serpentine Pavilion, the most last but one in a series of tremendous pavilions by architects that have been commissioned by the Serpentine Gallery over the last 15 or so years. So they continued their collaboration with Ai Weiwei via Skype. By that time he was out of prison in China but not allowed to travel freely, which he's still not. But together they developed an archaeological, invisible, underground concept, a palimpsest of foundations of the previous pavilions, 11 of them. They used cork and water, which had this visceral quality, and incorporated 11 columns representative of the previous pavilions. Now recently, Herzog has said that he doesn't know for them if collaborations with artists make so much sense now. Architects are spoiled now, he says, artists even more so. Strong statement. Collaborations are not based on the same sense of political urgency. They're not as natural as they were in the 60s and 70s, he says. But I'm not being prescriptive. Every generation has to find its own way. An exciting recent example, more recent example, case study in the field of art within architecture is the Oslo Opera House by Snøhetta Architects. It was finished in 2007. Kjetil Thorsen is the lead architect, and artists were commissioned from the outset of the project. Collaborations and interventions, and also freestanding work. The architects allowed the artists to make very distinctive contributions to be integrated within the surfaces, water, and the auditorium itself. And so here we see the full gamut of commissions, integrated, non-integrated, and actually totally separate in the case of the Monica Bonvicini sculpture, which is inspired by the painting by Caspar David Friedrich of the Ice Mare. There were highly positive factors here to commissioning. A cultural client. The architect was committed to art. There was an ongoing discussion, in fact, between Thorsen and Olafur Eliasson on the integrity of the professions, art and architecture. And very highest quality opportunities for artists were identified by an art panel of experts and by the architects. A strategy was developed. And here we see two of the interior commissions, one which is the stage curtain by the American artist Kay White. It's an entirely trompe-l'oeil surface. It is in fact flat and woven as a tapestry. And on the right, a series of walls by Olafur Eliasson, 340 square meters, which are lit with LEDs, and these change slightly all the time. There's a very slow movement of light, which he says is inspired by the space beneath glaciers. Other artist projects there included a video, film, and a book, The Foundation Stone. Now, these next few examples are really different approaches to my work over the last 20 or so years when commissioning art in relation to architecture. And you'll have figured by now, of course, that starting points and triggers vary from art being a focal point, carrying out a function, a celebration, commemoration, decoration, meeting planning requirements, or simply desire for art, simply the desire to commission the greatest piece. And the way that work evolves, architects approach us, clients approach us, also artists approach us, and we try to generate some artist initiated projects and see those through as well. And one of the early modus operandi projects, which I'm showing you here, is the Marinucci Art Project. The architecture here was by Mitsubishi's own in-house architects. It was a new building which had already been designed, it was under construction, and I, with the client and the architects, designated key areas for the integration of art. We wrote a generic brief, We selected artists through invited competition or direct invitation under the curatorial concept, the ideal place, which fitted fairly comfortably with the client's ambitions, as you can imagine, whilst introducing a note of irony on the artist's part. Such artist-designed locations quickly became the hallmarks of the building, popular places to hang out and meet, giving meaning to the corporate architecture. And there were a series of firsts, one of which was the first large-scale work by the Italian goldsmith Giampaolo Babetto, who designed the atrium space with these underground channels of lit, crushed glass, like arteries and veins, connecting the inside and the outside of the building. Susanna Heron, this was the first time this particular artist had worked with glass, which runs right through the building, and Sheila Wakely working for the first time on this scale, bringing nature into the building and creating a courtyard. And there were further works, as you can imagine. 6 artists, of course, were involved altogether. Our role is really to, through research and intuition, seek what I call a resonance and an equivalence between art and architecture, encouraging a creative interface between the artist and architect, and one where the artist's role is still distinctive and doesn't just blandly blend in. And having guided the selection process, the next step for us is to enable and facilitate the artist's commission, protecting their freedom to a large degree through budget cuts, changes of scenario, but still encouraging dialogue with the architect, the client, and where possible, the public, where there is a public to consult. New scale and new materials and techniques demanded by art in the public realm mean that I, as a curator, and indeed architects, are often required to support and guide artists in that process. Now, you would have thought, of course, that there would be relatively little problem integrating art into architecture where the art is functional. Also, one would think. St Martin-in-the-Fields, a Grade 1 listed 18th century building on Trafalgar Square by James Gibbs, heavily influenced by that architect's studies in Rome, was renewed by Eric Parry Architects, and I was introduced by the architect to the church and invited to develop the art strategy and the Commission's programme. Light was the overriding concept for the renewal, the strategy and the art commissions. The project was led by the vicar, and the art panel was appointed, chaired by Sir Nicholas Goodison. The east window was the first major commission. The previous east window was a post-Second World War, very kitsch, pink and blue window, which would replace the original one which had been bombed out. And I organised an invited competition. 5 artists were shortlisted, and Shirazé Rouget, with Pip Horn, her collaborator and partner architect, were appointed. Their first design was rejected. I just don't have that here, but their first design was rejected. It was like this, but more taut. And their second design was universally approved, but still highly controversial before it was installed, as the artist had never worked in glass before or on that scale. There was also huge opposition to the project by 2 major parties: the Worshipful Company of glass painters and engravers, so the livery company, and also there was opposition from the Prince of Wales, who put forward his own glass artist. He was consulted because St Martin-in-the-Fields is the Royal Parish Church. That advice was gently ignored, and we proceeded to commission Shirazé. And I suggested she collaborate with the Meyer Glass Studio in Munich, and the steelwork was made in London, and then the two had to match up. So it was a high-level risk, but once installed, it has been widely acclaimed and won awards and has brought new cultural publics to the church. It's been an extraordinary project. And that's an example of one of Scherz's paintings. So you can imagine sometimes uphill to convince an expert panel or a client, because an artist has worked in one way, how are they going to work in another, in a new material, on a new scale. She then went on to win the competition for the altar with a beautifully minimal form of the Italian travertine lit from within. And you can see that the ellipse on the window is lit at night as well from two hidden sources either side. We then went on to commission a processional cross by Brian Catling, who is a sculptor, poet and performance artist. And the poet laureate at the time, Andrew Motion, we commissioned to evolve a poem for the light well, which was conceived for the site, and there are further commissions planned and loans of artworks. And just continuing for a moment this theme, because I've really carried out very few works in places of worship, but these are two important ones. The United Reformed Church in Bloomsbury in London, known as the Lumen Project, the renewal here was carried out by Tyson Khan architects within a 1960s shell, replacing a 19th century church that had been bombed on the same site. And here we commissioned a large-scale work to inhabit the window fenestration. It was too late to treat the glass in the way that we did for St. Martin's contractually, but this works very successfully as a large-scale sculpture within the window. And we appointed Alison Wilding, who incidentally is an alumnus of British School at Rome, to carry out 3 fountains, a drinking fountain, a font and a garden fountain. And those are wonderfully sculptural within the space. That's the surface, the polished silver surface of the font. Lucky babies being christened there. And you see here the font and drinking fountain in relation to the architecture in this large conical form is the design of the architects Tyson Khan, who have become wonderful collaborators with artists as a result of this process. In the education sector, we've worked extensively with universities over the years. St. John's College in Oxford was one of the earliest of these in the early 90s. And here, art amplifies and rotates the building. We invited the UK's most celebrated jewellery designer to make the gate. She'd never made anything larger than a brooch before, and this has become a meeting place. Anything is possible through collaboration. If somebody's a great artist in whatever field or whatever medium, they do actually have the capacity, if they wish, to work in another sphere. Alex Belashenko, incidentally trained in painting and is now a well-known glass artist, was commissioned for screens throughout the quadrangle, and here he amplified the architectural concept, which was to do with rocks and falling water. So 2 major commissions, and we also had a printmaker documenting the whole process. But St. John's was also an occasion for a major artist not being commissioned, and that was Sir Howard Hodgkin, whom I invited to design a tapestry. There were 3 meetings between Sir Howard and the architect Richard McCormack, now Sir Richard McCormack, and it was quite clear that there was a major disagreement on almost every level. So I called a halt to that collaboration. It just wasn't going to go anywhere. And also in the education sector, City of Westminster College, another British School alumnus, Lothar Gertz. Now here his role started with a fixed location, with this highly coloured, gorgeous work that characterises the space as you walk into the building. But then his role was extended to influence the colour palette of the building's exterior envelope, and indeed further elements of furniture within. So that it moved out from being a fixed location to something that was much more fluid in terms of the artist's role. Now here you can see we're moving towards looking at the artwork as structure or wall, and thinking about art as wall, as part of the architecture, part of the structure. Michael Craig Martin, again, whose work we saw at the Laban Centre with Herzog and de Meuron, was commissioned for Woolwich DLR station through me, with his well-known vocabulary of everyday objects, vibrant colours. But for him it was the first, because it was the first time he'd worked in ceramic tile, which also meant that certain colours were not possible. But the resultant work has created the most incredibly vibrant sense of place and arrival and departure. Another wall, this time for the Barbican Centre, the renewal by Alfred Hall Monaghan Morris architects, which takes the architecture itself, the late 60s, early 70s architecture of the Barbican by Powell, Chamberlain and Bond, into this very slowly moving, lit, backlit light wall by Alex Hartley. So these images of the architecture were moving very slowly, horizontally and vertically behind the occluded glass wall. And another glass and light, just continuing this theme, working with our client, the Crown Estate. The Crown Estate of the Queen's own developers. It's rather good working with the Crown Estate. It means they don't have to borrow money because it's the Royal Bank. But they have become extremely important commissioners of art, sometimes because they have to, because it's part of planning consent, and many occasions because they want to commission art as part of their developments. And with the quadrant schemes, it's known, which is very, very near Piccadilly Circus. It involves the regeneration of the Regent Palace Hotel. We collaborated with Dixon Jones Architects and appointed a Swiss artist, Daniel Schönbeckler, who responded to the architectural design of the space and this mirrored ceiling by Dixon Jones. So her work was about emulating the sense of light that comes through trees in a forest. It's on a computer program, and as you can see, it reflects the viewer indeed in the mirrored space above. It's a beautifully interactive, gentle work, right off a very busy shopping hub and on the edge of Soho. And as part of the same scheme as well, we commissioned the American artist Spencer Finch for a piece where light interacts with and is emblematic of the building's usage, its temperature, humidity, elevator usage, energy consumption, and so forth. So these are LED lights and this again is a moving piece. And we're currently engaged in two pieces of cityscape either side of Regent Street with the same clients and with different architects. I wanted to just mention here how our starting points are. We don't necessarily go to artists who are famous for working in glass or light, because that is the possibility. So our research into new artists leads us in quite strange directions. An artist might work in film or in performance, for example, in live art, and then they might produce something quite different in the public realm. And my research in this case led me to a young Italian artist, Giulia Ricci, who's based in London. And all I'd seen of her work before were very, very ephemeral installations in floorscapes and some wall-based works. And then I was thinking how she could change scale of material, and she won the competition for these bronze screens and glass screens which will characterise a building just off Regent Street with Bard Setters architects. And you see here some of the very first computer-generated images, and then samples will follow. So that's the procedure. that will be adopted, all with the interaction and collaboration of the architects. So continuing then with this facade and surface treatment, one of the triggers for commissioning artists with architects has been arts lottery funding conditions. And this particular scheme, which was shortlisted for the Sterling Prize a few years ago by Harvey Tompkins Architects, the Young Vic Theatre near Waterloo, resulted from an emergency call to me from the architects. So we've got to get an artist on board in the next 3 weeks. Panic stations, got to meet Arts Council conditions. So we drew up a shortlist of artists, organised studio visits, and Clem Crosby, painter, was selected. And the result of collaboration you see here, which is the facade of the theatre. It was a question of identifying an artist whose work had the same raw and gestural qualities and sense of experiment and immediacy that equated to the theatre's work and to the approach to design and materials by the architects, which itself was characterised by a sense of provisional and using found materials sometimes. So here art is literally part of the building, but in fact for the last Architecture Biennale in Venice, 2 panels of the facade were taken out of this, demounted and taken to the Arsenale in Venice and shown, which was great. But whereas the starting point for the Young Vic was the synergy between the artist's gestural style of painting and Steve Tompkins' approach to architecture, with the Royal Court, where we see their work in progress in the artist's studio and the panels as they first went up on the facade. And with the Royal Court Theatre, which preceded this, the architect and artist Anthony Malinowski, now this was not through me, selected each other from a chance meeting at a party and a conversation about their passion for the colour red, and friendship followed. Vermilion was the colour chosen by the artist for the major work in the drum wall of the theatre, and a colour, of course, symbolic of the theatre's politics. And layer by layer, he built up this extraordinary work, which also bears the marks of the way that the sun tracks across through the windows onto the wall. And the artist's role itself extended to the choice of furniture and even to T-shirts. It was important too, as part of the brief, that the artwork could be seen from outside the theatre at night. So we're looking through this window onto this wonderfully glowing red wall. It was to the delight of the artist that Margaret Thatcher, when she was still alive, used to live in this neighbourhood, and he hoped it was going to affront her political sensibilities every time she went past there. But they developed a friendship, a shared understanding, and a level of telepathy, which is extraordinary. And they've gone on to collaborate on the Bush Theatre in London, the Chichester Festival Theatre, and the Everyman Theatre in Liverpool. You can see these are theatre architects. And friendships, while shotgun marriages between artists and architects can work and do work and are sometimes incredibly exciting, other collaborations are based on friendship, choosing one another, as is the case of David Adjaye and Chris Ofili, who met while students at Royal College of Art in the architecture and painting departments respectively. Friendship, shared cultural values and objectives and sensibilities, that was the basis. Adjaye has also collaborated with Olafur Eliasson. But with Ofili, his collaborations include what you see here, the Folkestone Library, where the artist has worked in glass and also with this provisional plywood material. And also Adjaye and Ofili collaborated on the project The Upper Room, which is shown first at Victoria Miro Gallery and then bought by Tate, and then at the Venice Biennale in 2003. So, collaborations based on friendship. continuing with the role of art in cultural and leisure building specifically, and to echo the title of this series, Art Literally Meeting Architecture, Sculpture Created in Relation to Architecture, we'll look at examples such as Anthony Gormley, who we appointed to work at the Roundhouse in London for the renewal of the project by McCaslin Architects, where Gormley adopted quite a classical role for sculpture atop the building. And this was a precursor of his series of installations on tops of buildings around the South Bank in relation to his Hayward Gallery show. So art positioned in relation to architecture is also a very interesting form of meeting. And we commissioned this work for the Olympic Park, run by Monica Bonvicini in this very strict typeface with no sense of urgency about it at all, not in italics, clearly, but placed outside the handball arena by Make, and became a very, very popular artwork. It reflects the letters one on another, it reflects the viewing surface and so forth. But going back to Anthony Gormley in relation to architecture, he of course, as many artists have, commissioned interesting architects to design their own studios, and most recently, post-studio Eric Parry designed for Gormley, David Chipperfield has designed the latest Gormley studio. Here, Anthony Gormley was selected by Reardon Smith Architects to design a hotel room as part of their scheme in Mayfair. And this is now happening. So this form, as you see it up here, is a sculpture, but it's also a hotel room, a whole suite, and will be, we understand, extremely expensive to stay. But it's an inhabitable sculpture, and just does come with a very expensive type price tag. So sculpture can take on this architectural scale and function. Caro used to call it architecture, or sculpture, or something that went across those boundaries. This one is an island by Guido Conci again. We saw his work at Storefront in New York. And interestingly, Conci, who initially worked as a poet and performance artist, he works with young architects in his studio in Brooklyn. Whereas conversely, of course, some architects, such as Will Alsop, engage young artists to work in their studios and make models. So it's kind of mutual relationship. So this is both sculpture and performing arts venue and bridge and meeting place, all in one. And Simeon Nelson, Sonia Labour and David Chesler created a bridge in Melbourne which incorporates sounds of all the languages that are spoken in Australia. It was commissioned on the occasion of the World Student Games, 200 metres long, articulated by sound. So art as structure, as architecture, as bridge. Paddington Bridges on the left, Thomas Heatherwick with this bridge that curls up like a snail shell and unrolls as you walk towards it, obligingly. And on the right, a very minimalist sculpture, which is also a bridge by Langton Bell. So we see this typology, the bridge, architecture designed by artists, pavilions designed by artists, this one by, of course, very well-known artist Dan Graham, and even a fence by an artist cast in Nicolai, which took the colours of the Olympic rings and then extrapolated those into a sound wave pattern. The scale of major projects such as the Olympic Games and transport infrastructure schemes open up further scope, of course, for artist, architect and artist, engineer, architect type of collaborations. So collaborations on functional structures, which are also sculptures. We see here Orbit by Anish Kapoor with Cecil Balmond, an engineer with whom we have an existing partnership. Catherine Findlay was the advisory architect here. In my opinion, not necessarily their finest hour. It, to me, neither is aesthetically satisfactory as a sculpture nor as a viewing platform, but those who live close to it say it grows on you. But nevertheless, a huge structure and one which has very much characterised the London Olympic Park. But Anish obviously was no stranger to collaborations with architects, and his collaboration with Amanda Levitt, later Future Systems, on Napoli entrance stations. The entrances you see here are still computer-generated images, and I understand that these are not yet complete, that the contractor had gone into administration, so he said these are not yet realised, but they're very, very ambitious projects and very exciting in terms of our discussion about artist-architect collaboration. And the original brief was set by the city of Naples to create a fusion between art and a fully functioning metro station, whilst creating what we said should be a central focal point for the city, which would potentially coincide with the planned urban and cultural redevelopments in that area. And Amanda Levitt, talking here in 2007, said the artist I got on best with was Anish Kapoor, whose language is closer to mine than either Anthony Gormley or Matthew Barney, and strangely that's made collaboration more stimulating. Our worldviews are parallel, the target is to fuse them. Joint ventures, she says, between artists and architects are about managing to blend ideas. To me, the artist's critical role is interesting. Authorship of the work is a key issue, which one can fall out over since it's only natural you'll both want to decide one way or another. This hasn't happened with Anish. She says the storm passes and we both come out pleased. We architects are used to teamwork, and many characters bear on our work. Artists are one of them. So that was 7 years ago. Now this leads us to the role of artists and architects in creating places, collaborations between artists, architects, landscape architects, engineers and planners. And of enormous interest in this field is the High Line in New York City, which is a collaboration between James Corner Field Operations and Dylan Scorpidio and Renfro Architects. It has an artworks program. It is redundant. I'm sure many of you know this, many of you would have been there, but it's roughly 3 kilometres of redundant elevated rail track across Manhattan. And in fact, it was an artist-led initiative to save the High Line, and a campaign was mounted, and it's become the most enormously successful model for urban regeneration and indeed the site of artist interventions. Property prices have soared around there. This 2010 work by Barbara Kruger puts her finger on it, where the High Line has generated this interest in property, art, money, etc. So you notice the shift here towards the artist's role interacting with or designing buildings and moving into designing the setting for buildings. Bruce Nauman, with his square depression, as it was known, was designed in the 70s and finally built in 2007 in Munster. So here we have art as sculpture, as public space. Daniel Buren responded to the architecture of the Palais Royal, creating this extraordinary project which has recently been refurbished. It's been in existence for 25 years and it literally created a new place in Paris that was previously car parks for bureaucrats. And in Chicago, the John Plenser Crown Fountain carried out about 10 years ago, which creates a place that celebrates the inhabitants of Chicago, inviting them to walk on water and it's resulted from an artist-architect-engineer collaboration here. It's very populist and conceptually and technically extremely accomplished, which is a very hard thing to pull off. Now, if all of this is looking a bit comfortable, let me return to artists' preoccupation with architecture and their often very uneasy relationship with it. Aren't artists and architects old enemies after all? Such interventionist, deconstructivist attitudes are brilliantly exemplified in the work of Gordon Matter Clark, working in the 70s, splitting a villa in two, who was highly influential on many artists, but particularly Richard Wilson, working in the UK, with his turning the place over, where he's literally carved into the facade of the building and flipped it round. It's not often artists get a chance to do this. It's a temporary project finally realised in Liverpool. Or indeed to do this, to flood a gallery with oil cutting into the space. This is in its fourth iteration, currently in the latest Saatchi gallery. Started off in Matt's gallery in London. Or indeed this, in Bordeaux, where Daniel Buren has tilted the gallery's architecture back on himself. So such interventions challenge the status quo, and they result in a new reading for us, or a changed meaning of the architecture, such as this installation in the swimming pool, which I commissioned some years ago, transforming an empty pool through light and evoking memories of a closing event for the pool. And Felice Barini, working in London, France and Italy, creating these amazing trompe-l'oeil installations. So here the viewer literally completes the work as a perspectival shift, resulting in art that make you see the architecture anew. So artists appropriate architecture from domestic scale to grand scale. Christo and Jean-Claude with their wrapping of the Reichstag, literally you saw the building anew once unwrapped. But during the 20 years that it took them to gain permission to wrap the Reichstag, of course the whole meaning of the building had changed, the whole political regime had changed, the function of the building had changed. But once unwrapped, one sees it always with the memory of how it was wrapped. And JR, French photographer working here in Rio, worked with communities to give new visibility and identity to the localities of favelas. An amazing temporary project. And Roger Hyons with the seizure. Now here, we're on a domestic scale, we see a very surreal interior of copper sulfate crystals within an abandoned social housing apartment in southeast London. It's an Art Angel project which has recently been relocated to Yorkshire Sculpture Park, but literally making the ordinary extraordinary. As did House by Rachel Whiteread, where the artist, through Art Angel again, she chose to pass the entire interior space of a domestic house, the middle of a terrace, due for demolition. The project was on a temporary license from Tower Hamlets, the local authority, but such was the success of this sculpture that she went on to win the Turner Prize, and a lobby for it to remain permanently arose. However, Tower Hamlets kept the original agreement and the house was demolished. However, the project remains permanently in the memory and in documentation, of course. Changing the meaning of buildings, Jenny Holtz's light works which scroll across buildings, these transform architecture and public places through light with text works that are generated by or question the function of the building. As indeed did one here, work number 289 in 2003 by Martin Creed, which is both ironic and affirmative. I thought it should have been commissioned on Christopher Smith's appointment here. Apparently the Romanian Academy's response, however, was to mount the retort, everything is not going to be all right. In terms of artists' appropriation of architectural forms, within this context it's important to mention the Four Plinth and the extraordinary work of Mark Wallinger, which inaugurated that programme, and of course he'll be speaking here in a few weeks' time and will tell you all about this project. But here the plinth is the formal architectural element within Trafalgar Square. This one remained empty, and the programme that has followed has been quite extraordinary, generated by the Royal Society of Arts, now run by the Greater London Authority through the Mayor's Cultural Office. And as well as this, which is a classical Christ figure on the eve of the millennium, there have been a variety of artist responses, including, of course, Rachel Whiteread, who took the form of the architectural plinth itself and cast it and placed it. So entitled Monuments, the plinth, as it were, monumentalizes itself. Now these collaborations, these based on open-ended dialogues, are, as I mentioned earlier, still comparatively rare, but one such was Richard Deacon and Richard Rogers. Back in the 80s, their shared enthusiasm for Charles' Maison de Verre resulted in a collaboration on the creation of a film about the architecture of that building entitled Wall of Light. So that collaboration arose entirely naturally. But as may be evident, brokering and curating interdisciplinary collaborations and integrating art in the public realm has underpinned my career for the last 25 or so years. And in the early days of the Architecture Biennale in Venice, in the early 90s, I decided to curate an artist-architect collaboration and invited Pierre Gavoine, on the right architect, and the artist duo Dan Harvey and Heather Ackroyd off-screen to collaborate. And they developed, I should say Ackroyd and Harvey have worked with living materials, notably in their career, grass, which has clad many buildings and interiors. Together they developed a concept host. Host as an edicule, the earliest form of architecture, or little hut. Venice as a host city, and also the meaning of the host as part of the communion host. So it resulted in a multi-sided installation in a former oratory, which you see here, almost impossible to photograph, in a gallery and in a calle, where the concept took different forms, from the grass edicule in the previous slide to a sculptural installation made from communion wafers and communion wine, to finally a customized condom machine which dispensed packets of 3 communion hosts. This was extremely controversial. You put a euro in and you got your 3 communion hosts. And you got your euro back. It was not a very good thing about it. But it was an interesting collaboration because it started from nothing. It was generated in Venice, it grew out of Venice, and then manifested itself in these different forms. But since then, of course, the whole notion of artists working and being integrated in the public realm and within architecture has gained ground enormously. And I'll conclude with 2 very brief projects, one complete, one ongoing. BBC Broadcasting House, you can see where we are. This is an existing 30s listed building. That's All Souls Church, grade 1 listed by John Nash. And this is the new BBC all around here. It's Portland Place and Oxford Circus is there. We were appointed by the BBC in 2001. The project was completed in 2012. It's exceeded its budget, that's not the art budget, it's the building budget, many times over. The original architects were fired, and the project was completed by executive architects. So I led the art programme working with a public art group chaired by Alan Yentor, and developed a strategy which resulted in a 4-stranded programme of permanent temporary artists on site education and community projects. So I'll just explain to you what happened. This is a computer-generated image showing the 3 permanent commissions: lighting for cells in the front of BH, a new artist-designed public space, and a sculpture which emerges from and goes right into the building, as it were, creating a trilogy of vertical elements with the radio mast and so forth. So, whilst the programme was being developed, we commissioned a series of artists' raps by Fiona Ray and Liz Deal and other artists. We invited artists to create videos. This is a still from Catherine Yass's video, which is now important archival footage. There was documentation by John Riddy, who's an artist photographer. I think many of these are either restored interiors or lost interiors. And we also looked at a very odd room in the complex room 101, which had been the inspiration for George Orwell's room 101 in his novel 1984. And Orwell had worked for the BBC towards the end of the Second World War. This room had become so unpopular, so it became a boiler room. We invited Rachel Whiteread to look at it and respond to it, and she said, I would like to cast the whole room. And the resultant work you see here, which has literally become sort of metaphor for the body under attack, as it were, inspired by the torture chamber in 1984 by Orwell. This installation was in the V&A Castports for 1 year, and subsequently bought by the Centre Georges Pompidou in Paris. But for the permanent works, you see here the light work by Richmond Creeper, the sculpture by Plenzer, which bears a poem entitled Breathing by the artist. And this sculpture is now dedicated to news journalists killed on location. It's an inversion, as you can see, of the Spire of All Souls. And it was also a collaboration between the artist and the architect, Richard McCormack. The final piece to be realised was the new public space by artist Mark Pimlott, and his concept was entitled World. It imagines that you're on part of the world and the BBC, through its World Service, reaches internationally to places both small and strange and well-known and far-flung and near at hand. At night it is lit with this constellation of stars, and sounds emanate from the paving. And it has become an important place to meet and for interviews. So it's very much part of the life of the building. Of course, there's always one that got away. You're looking here at drawings by Anish Kapoor, left, Richard McCormack, middle, and both of them working on the same drawing on the right, on a hanging library or archive, which was my idea within the central atrium of the BBC. The BBC loved this idea until they realised how much it was going to cost. And then the whole concept, I'm afraid, just melted away with only the drawings left. BH, the broadcasting house, was finally opened by Her Majesty the Queen in June 2013. And the final project is in Oxford for the University of Oxford, the Radcliffe Observatory Quarter. So the first task here with this 12-acre site was to write a strategy and develop a programme of permanent and temporary work. It's a former health site. There is an infirmary on site, now Humanities. The master plan was by Vignoli, taken up by Neil McLaughlin, architect, and we have now an artist working site-wide, Simon Perriton, whose constellation of locations you see charted in this magenta here. And here we have a building by Herzog and Dumeron. This is Mathematics by Vignoli. This is a listed building, a listed square. The New Health building. And this is the Radcliffe Observatory. Radcliffe, who was a doctor in Oxford, left his wealth to the Radcliffe Camera, the library, also to the infirmary, also to the observatory. So our task here is to develop a synergy between art, architecture and landscape and the academic disciplines on site. The site-wide art and science comparison, this concept is an alchemical tree, symbolising an earlier form of university where the disciplines were more integrated, and the starting point is a found image. And this will find a sculptural form, and then there will be outline elements of the alchemical tree throughout the site. And then finally, we've recently commissioned Susan Collins for a temporary installation in the Radcliffe Observatory, which was linked to weather on site, to winds and weather and changing humidity, changing temperature. So a collaboration here with architecture and with nature. So to conclude, collaborations, interventions and confrontations. Many architects and artists now, I would say, are far more prepared to collaborate than ever before. We see this as a way of working in the 21st century. And there are various policies and conditions necessary for successful collaboration. Time to understand each other's practice and develop a shared concept. Willingness to work as part of a team. Artists, of course, are more used to working independently. Open-mindedness about an open-ended quest. Mutual respect for each other's creativity. Recognition of what either party can bring to the project. Trust and generosity, with friendship as being a massive bonus. Very often a shared passion or interest in an external related subject, such as the colour red or the maison de verre. An enjoyment of different perspectives and differences as well as shared objectives, and commitment to working it through or to calling a halt if it clearly isn't working. All of which sounds very much like relationship counselling. So that is in a sense, the sensitivity of the relationships we've been talking about here. We've been looking at the process and the end result, but of course then there is the whole catalyst in between in bringing this about, and that's where the curator's role comes in. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was really, really interesting and very precise as a kind of overview of many different cases and chances and possibilities to work together. I would like just to ask you a question. I mean, when there's a chance to start a collaboration between artists and architects, do they have to start together, or at the same moment, or it's possible that one can come just before or after the first has already engaged? And also, I would like to know something more about the budget problems, because this I think is very interesting. I mean, how you organize a budget, how you manage a budget, and who is going to define the budget. And the budget defined before or after or in between? I mean, okay. That's it.
Okay, so when does the artist or architect get appointed? And ideally, they should start at the same moment, but that's hardly ever the case. It's usually the architect, as you can imagine, that starts the project, and with the client and possibly with a curator such as myself, identifies the opportunities for art.
So it starts from the art.
Very young, almost always, I would say. There was one occasion where we got to appoint the architects, and we had an artist involved on the panel that appointed the architects. That is rare. I would like to think that the artists could be on board with the architect as soon as possible after, because as you can imagine, then collaboration is so much easier, and whatever art budget is identified will go very much further as well, because the artists can get to advise on things like materials budgets. And so then you can roll the art budget together with glass, with surfaces, with water, whatever, signage. So that was, and the second question was
the budget.
The budget. Certainly in the UK, it's hardly ever 1% of the total, because we're not very strict. We're a nation of shopkeepers, and every local authority is allowed to do its own thing when it comes to public art. Some follow a 1%, some think about it, some expect developers to provide the 1% for art. In which case, most developers don't go to the level of 1%, they maybe go to 0.5%. Or identify what they feel is a workable sum. And in most instances where I'm involved as a curator, it is simply a sum that is identified. It won't necessarily bear a relationship to a percentage of the building. It will be what is felt can be afforded within the scheme. Yeah. In the case of the BBC, we did actually arrive at 0.5% of the budget, but then the architectural schemes I mentioned earlier went many times over budget. So the 0.5% is now probably 0.1%. It should be on a sliding scale and index linked if it's a percent, and that's the case with many American schemes. So, not an easy answer.
I know.
In the case of St Martin in the Fields, there was no art budget identified at all. But places of worship and universities too, they do get their bequests, for example, and sometimes those are quite wide open in terms of how they might be spent. In the East Window for St Martin's case, we had a donor who said they would leave £100,000. When it went well over that budget, they upped it to 200,000, which was enough to cover the cost. So,
no restriction of materials. I mean, if just in a case an artist wants to use the materials and then it's not possible, I mean,
yes, it sometimes happens.
Or maybe too expensive, I know it's...
Sometimes the material is too expensive, sometimes, as with architecture, sometimes the building materials have to be cut back or second choices made.
So the artists they agree to change their project or
yes,
their
they
material.
do, and I found artists are so pragmatic, and they're making those kind of decisions every day of their work, after all about, can they afford, not many artists choose to work in bronze nowadays, but for example, the Art Pauvre, the whole ethos was working with poor materials. So people are used to thinking laterally, and I think artists are brilliant at that, about thinking laterally when to change material, change scale, and so forth. And very often, actually, the architect might introduce new possibilities in terms of materials to the artist, because of their very wide exposure to different industrial materials and processes. And that itself can take the artist's work much further.
Which was the more difficult work you've done? I'm curious.
I think the east window of St Martin in the Fields was very difficult.
With Shirazé?
Yeah.
But because of Shirazé or because
No, Shirazé was a dream.
Okay.
The secret to working with Shirazé is that for this she brought in her husband and partner, Pip Horn, who was an architect, and enormously pragmatic, so if at any point Shirazé could not see a way through, Pip could. So as a duo, it's absolutely.
So it was a duo, yes.
Yeah.
It was a couple.
Yeah. And the BBC project was extremely difficult. At one point, the Plenser was completely cancelled. And I didn't tell the artist until after I persuaded the BBC to reinstate it as a project. I then told them what had happened.
Do you have some questions for Vivien? Avete delle domande? Perché è stato molto interessante la conferenza, veramente.
This was really fascinating for me, especially in this stuff. I have a slightly wider question. Obviously, you showed us different kinds of collaborations, from very institutional ones to more spontaneous, informal friendships. You use parallel as marriage or even divorce and spinning up in some of the cases. And you also showed us a very successful modus operandi of functioning as a platform for this kind of bringing together this kind of different relationships. And maybe my question is out of ignorance, but I wonder how unique this modus operandi is in terms of facilitating this kind of relationships and collaborations, and not just in Britain but also elsewhere in Europe, and what is the role of this kind of organization and how you can see in the future in terms of maybe reaching out, as you do already, and you showed beyond Britain and collaborating with similar institutions that they are.
Yeah, as you've gathered, it's an incredibly labour-intensive process. The tip of the iceberg is the work that you see finally on site. And I think there's always, almost always a role for a creative catalyst like a curator or little organisation like Modus Operandi. Different things work in different countries. In the States, they have city art commissioners, and those work pretty well. They have panels of experts, and they're led by paid employees who are part of the local authority. And then there are private consultants, single consultants. So that's the balance, really. In Britain, we have a bit of this and a bit of that, and it keeps changing model. My last organisation was Arts Council funded. We knew that the funding was gradually diminishing. You know, I set up Modus Operandi because I wanted it to stand on its own feet and not be subject to the vagaries of changing policies and so forth. So I think that there's scope for, certainly this type of role in many other countries. And SCORE in Amsterdam is a brilliant organisation, for example, that's recently had its government funding cut altogether, and they don't know how to operate as independent consultants because they're not used to doing so. So I think different models at different times in different places, you have to be sensitive to market forces, government agencies, policies, and so forth, and act accordingly. So, not an easy answer.
Thank you. Yes, frightening.
Yeah.
May I ask a follow-up question? Not least you mentioned the £200,000 that came for the window at St Martin's. I'm very conscious London is a city of vast amounts of wealth, private wealth. Do you think, honestly, you can achieve this kind of incredible success in the capital city without that kind of private money?
It depends how you define success, because I think many of the projects I showed you are really quite small scale. And with the Second Church project, for example, the budgets there are really, really quite tiny. I think it's always possible to do something interesting, even with modest scale budgets. And it's the ingenuity of artists that makes that happen. And working with existing budgets, even for architecture in the public realm, is down to careful creative choices. So it need not be the large-scale, glamorous project funded by rich patron at all. Those are the exception, I quite agree. And London is a bubble in terms of its economy. Other cities in the UK, of course, suffering hugely. But I rely on the creativity of artists.
First, thank you. It's been a really interesting overview on a really incredible series of projects, and I believe as well the power of collaborations landscape. My question is, correct me if I'm wrong, but most of the projects you've been showing are very big commissions in some ways, right? Where like you see, or an important organization is commissioning through your organization, and it's usually an artist and an architect to work in a collaborative way. But what about, do you think there is space for housing to work this way? To projects which are not monuments to some extent, but they are instead functional. Do you see this as a...
Very, very much so. There have been some amazing artist projects with housing schemes that have been really modestly funded and yet enormously effective. And I left out whole swathes of work which is about non-commissioned practice in relation to architecture, like street art, for example, of which is enormously rich, and it's not just Banksy, there are many artists out there just not waiting to be commissioned, just acting in a guerrilla sense and creating their own work, creating urban gardens, for example, that have no commission attached to them at all. It's a really healthy strand of work. So yes, I totally agree with you.
Thank you very much. Grazie a tutti. Thank you, Vivien. It was really fantastic and very interesting. Thank you to the public, and thank you to the British School.